Hello, hello, welcome, please come in. We've reached the end of the monk-only runs, we've punched and kicked our way through 5 different Final Fantasies, and it's now time for the summary, where we go through how all those went and compare the various experiences. And Monk is a really interesting class. Relying mostly on unarmed attacks throughout their history means Monk tends to be a bit one-note with limited strategic options, but able to do very big damage. Sometimes. As such, Monks were a really fun class to go through. How well did the limited strategic options work out across the many iterations of the class in these games? And the answer was mostly pretty good. Monks may not be complicated, but they are usually effective. But that's enough preamble talking about nothing, let's dive into the actual comparison. And that starts with difficulty and Final Fantasy I. And let's place FF1 directly in third. Calling FF1 difficult is a bit complicated, especially for a class as simple to use as Monk, because it's not necessarily difficult. There's really just the one strategy, select the attack command, hope your numbers are high enough. It did get a bit more interesting once I got the canoe, because I could then actually make decisions about how to progress, and of course immediately beelined it to the class upgrade, because wow did I need the class upgrade, and of course the tonics available for purchase from that point on. However, that kind of just changed the strategy to use tonics with every character, except one super buffed character who should attack for big damage. This is an effective strategy, but it is also the same strategy used in every run of FF1 because it's kind of the only strategy that works. And that made the game mostly pretty breezy until I hit the brick wall, Chaos, right at the end of the game. I don't feel the need to go into that too much, but Chaos is really just poorly tuned in this version of the game, and the increase in challenge for the prior Tiamat fight to the final boss is silly. And because monks don't have any skills or abilities or really anything to make them more effective, the ending really just became a grinding fest to try and get my levels high enough to actually beat the boss. And should that count as difficulty? I guess. I mean, this is a turn-based RPG with a leveling system, so there will always be some degree of needing to get your numbers higher than your enemies. And that was definitely true here. However, other than that one grind at the end of the game, monks mostly handled the challenge of FF1 pretty well. Monks have no meaningful equipment options in this game, with their defenses and attack both scaling off their level. They also don't get any spells. That means mostly breezing through the game, just punching down every enemy in their path. So while there is some real challenge in the end, it's not nearly as high as a few other entries, but also not as easy as some others will get to. So, as is often the case, FF1 gets to be delightfully mid. And that brings us to FF3, and the difficulty thereof. And I think we'll slot FF3 into the second slot of difficulty. FF3 Monks Only is mostly more difficult than FF1. It's kind of complicated. Just like in FF1, monks don't really have any interesting combat options for most of the game. Just remove weapons, press attack, hope your numbers are high enough. Monks also ran into a bit of a pain point with the giant rat fight, requiring you to have your entire party minied. And while FF3 introduced a lot of spellcasting items, drop rates for these are bad enough, and monks have terrible spellcasting stats anyway. Which makes sense, because they can't do that. And the biggest boon FF1 had, the purchasable tonics to boost attack, don't exist, meaning the monk must stand on its own. On the plus side, monk's damage scales much better in this game, mostly because unbuffed physical attacks just scale better in general. So, despite lack of options, monks mostly manage to punch through the game mostly unchecked. And then comes the class change that comes earlier than expected, cough, which improves all the damage scaling once you get your job level back up, and means you can really start dishing out damage. The special commands you can get are of dubious value, but the increase to basic physical attacks is considerable. But then comes the endgame. All the fun of overtuned chaos from FF1, but across 6 different bosses this time. In a row, and you can't take a break at any point. And that endgame is really what puts FF3 over 1 in the difficulty comparison. Before that, they're kind of close, but FF3's endgame is just brutal. Now, I will say Monk actually does better than really any other class I've done. I think it's even better than Ninja, just because monks can deal stupid high damage at no cost, whereas ninjas need to afford shurikens. Once I got my characters up to an appropriate level, I was pretty shocked by the amount of health I had and the amount of damage I was dealing. And while the final bosses in FF3 are no joke, none of them were really that dangerous, especially with my stock of elixirs. But FF3 does still sit in the second slot in difficulty. And continuing that trend, we reach FF5, which easily slides into the top slot in difficulty. And this was really the only game that I was sure of its placement going into the series. FF5 is a pretty tricky game in a lot of ways. While a lot of that can be managed with careful strategies or taking advantage of enemy weaknesses, monks are uniquely terrible at doing any of that. It's honestly the real reason why monk drops off in usability as the game progresses. Early on, monks have good health, good damage, some decent abilities, but nothing they do really scales as well as it needs to. And having no weapon access means they can't even target elemental weaknesses or status vulnerabilities or any of that. And if there's one thing I've learned from my many playthroughs of FF5, raw damage is almost always secondary to nonsense, and monks have basically no nonsense. The inclusion of some abilities for the monk did add in some strategic decision-making in some places. Chakra was very helpful early on with basic healing, though it scales so poorly it feels like the game is mocking me. The HP plus abilities were incredible for taking monks' high HP to even higher levels. Even Focus, an ability that I had always assumed was worthless, ended up being very useful when I learned to deal full damage from the back row, and also I think bypasses some boss reactions that only trigger on basic attacks. Focus in FF3 was complete garbage. Here it was surprisingly versatile, but hoo boy was there some nonsense. Byblos is always a huge wall in any run that doesn't have big fire damage, or status effects. Axe Death was a complete nightmare, and half the Rift bosses were surprisingly difficult for monks with their no strategic options. And the Omniscient fight, gaining off a decent amount of the endgame optional content, was a problem. I mean, the Kaiser Knuckles probably wouldn't have been more useful than Haste, but it's hard to say. I will need to figure out a solution to that for other physical classes, because some of those items are really useful. But that's a later problem. For now, where the question of difficulty comes in, it's very easy to see why FF5 was the hardest run. There just isn't anything in the other games that can come close to the difficulty that FF5 presents. FF5 really has such a wide variety of difficulties depending on what solo class you get stuck with. Anyway, moving on. And then in comes 10-2, and I was really torn between this and 12, but I think I'm going to place 10-2 in the second to last slot in difficulty, which, considering how 10-2 has fared in these rankings for previous series, is interesting. Honestly, the biggest reason this class is so low is, well, damage. After doing a Thief and Machinist run, I was really curious how this game would hold up to a class that was actually designed to hurt the enemy at all. And yeah, Berserkers really meet the brief of being monks, and they absolutely wrecked shop. So many fights I was expecting to be difficult, and so few were. I'm trying to think. The last LeBlanc fight was difficult because I forgot to heal. The Mega Sisters were a struggle because I didn't prioritize the counter abilities like I should have, and was a bit under-leveled at that point. And then there was... Wait, was that it? I think so. I mean, even aside from the big health and big damage, Berserkers actually have skills that are useful. It's not just 6 flavors of steel or infinite healing. Crackdown could break through defensive buffs. I had a few status inflicting abilities that were occasionally useful. Healing was still a problem throughout the entire game, as normal, but that was helped by really high health pools and auto regen. I was really expecting some of the trickier Vegnagun fights to be roadblocks, but they just weren't. Berserkers in this game are really just everything monks should aim to be. Exemplars of physical damage. They have high HP, they have actually useful abilities that do things and aren't just terrible healing and an attack that provides no benefit from an economy standpoint. So yeah, Berserker only was not especially difficult, but it still wasn't the easiest run. For that, we have to go to FF12, earning that last spot on difficulty. Because while there were a few difficult fights, like the Tomato family and also Elder Worm, it was all status effects, wasn't it? But other than that, monks in this game just had nothing that could stop them. They just have too much going for them. They have the most HP plus floors, which really shows. Those HP totals near the end were frankly hilarious, especially with the health boost from light armor. Oh, sorry, I couldn't possibly be threatened by you. I have 6,000 HP. They also have poles, which aren't the most damaging weapon in the game, but they have a good combo rate and a much higher physical evasion stat than they should. They can also hit flying enemies. I was impressed with spears on the Ulan, but poles basically have the same benefits and way more defensive utility. It's kind of silly. And then there is healing. As with most physical classes in this game, healing is a pretty big issue. FF12 enemies deal a lot of damage very quickly, and you really need dedicated healing at all times to keep up. And Monk kind of suffers from that, though they do get all potion lores, although the last one is locked behind Shemhazai. But at the end game, the point where my healing ability would normally be stretched the most, In comes Kiraja, completely undercutting any difficulty the final section of this game should have. I talked about it more in the video itself, but why does Monk get Kiraja for free? Yeah, it's weaker than it would be on a dedicated spellcaster, but it's also strong enough that who cares? Vaughn was curing 2000 HP with every cast, and that was without any magic lores. And I was using Sage Ring for efficiency rather than something to actually boost the healing amount. It meant that all the endgame fights were complete pushovers. I just can't see anything even remotely trying to take out the party when I have comical amounts of health and comical amounts of healing. It's real telling that the FF12 video is the shortest FF12 video I have released thus far, because there just wasn't that much interesting to talk about. I had unreasonable health, infinite healing, and my damage was okay. And of course I won. And that brings us right back to Final Fantasy I in the recommended section. And FF1 is going to go, I think, in dead last. It's just not interesting at all. Monks are good, quite good, except basic attacks by themselves are always pretty weak in FF1. No, you're really required to buff up your character's attacks with tonics, and you could say, that's FF1 for every class. And you are correct, hypothetical YouTube viewer questioning my decisions and mindset. And that is, in fact, the problem. FF1 Monks Only is basically the same as every other playthrough, but without haste. Which, rather than making an interesting tactical decision, just ends up making the whole thing a little more tedious because haste is really good at getting those damage numbers up, and there isn't really a replacement for that. I mean, realistically, I think the only class that actually felt really different is White Mage, because healing. Monks just get nothing. Their stats improve when they get a class change, but they're the only class that never learns magic, meaning they are entirely stuck with using the spellcasting items, tonics, etc. that literally every class has access to, so they don't end up feeling even slightly distinct. Combine that with a rough endgame fight against Chaos that will make you grind up 20 more levels for a single boss, and yeah, Final Fantasy I gets to be placed pretty low. Final Fantasy I usually trends towards the lower end of these rankings because it was the first game in the series, but here it's particularly bad. And we reach FF3, which usually suffers similar problems to FF1, and that is equally true here. Monks, and then Black Belts, are just really one-dimensional classes. They at least get Focus and Kick in the Pixel Remaster version, but while that does technically add some versatility in their kit, it's not actually very good. Focus is confusing in that I don't understand why you would ever use it. It just increases the amount of time it takes to make an attack, and the damage increases is functionally proportional to the amount of time it takes to do that. So like, I can focus twice, attack once, and deal the same damage as 3 attacks in the same amount of time, so why? And while Kick could genuinely be useful, it's only useful in fights with more than 2 targets, which is 0 bosses. So it's a nice utility for leveling, but otherwise worthless. The whole giant rat fiasco also makes this run lower on the list than it would otherwise be, though that is also going to be a problem for every non-spellcasting class in FF3. However, FF3 does get to score higher than FF1. Not because there are really any tactical decisions to make, but because Monks and Black Belts are just better in this game. Seriously, between their actually high HP and impressive damage, Black Belts are serious endgame threats. I'd slept on this class in prior casual runs, but I can absolutely see always bringing a Black Belt in the final series of fights. And even before the class improvement, Monks are just good. Simple and a bit bland, but they are very effective. And honestly, after some of the nonsense I've had to deal with for these series, I will take it. And we keep chugging along and it reaches Final Fantasy III, and this gets to be placed in second, which is honestly higher than I was really expecting going into this. A part of that is that I was expecting it to be really difficult, which, to be fair, it was, but I was also expecting it to be annoying. Particularly after completing FF1 and FF3, I was skeptical about the tactical value Monks would be able to provide in this game, and I was weirdly wrong. Chakra, despite scaling basically not at all, was surprisingly useful in the early game, and it actually stayed useful way longer than I thought. I was expecting maybe through Garula, but it was useful through Liquid Flame. Okay, so it was one more boss. I'd say really Focus was the biggest surprise in the run. Full back row damage, doesn't trigger some boss counterattacks because it's not the attack command, hits through Protect, which I just now remembered, I genuinely assumed it would be trash, like it was in FF3. But it was the big tactical button that monks had to work with. I only dropped it right at the end for the Neo X death fight, because the utility just wasn't strong enough to keep up with the HP plus 30%. Which, fair, few single abilities can keep up with 30% more health, especially on a class that already has a good chunk of health. And there are definitely fights that are less fun. The X-Death fight at the end of World 2 was unpleasant. The Crystal fight in the Forest of Moor managed to weaponize counterattack against me, which was very rude. Melusine was immune to physical attacks for most of the fight. But despite those pain points, this run was a lot more interesting, a lot more engaging than I'd expected. And while it was also the most difficult to navigate, difficulty doesn't really matter that much to me. I care about how interesting a run is, and this managed to take the cake. Now just to figure out how to deal with Omniscient in future series. And that takes us to 10-2, and you're looking at the open slots and thinking, wow, 10-2 managed to crawl all the way from last place in prior rankings into third? What a glow up! What a victory! And no, actually, you're wrong, because 10-2 is going in first place. It glowed up all the way to first. And I am also kind of baffled. Those who've seen my item specialist summary or thief ninja summary will know that 10-2 has often fared poorly in these recommendation sections, and often have received some harsh criticism. And to be clear, I stand by basically everything I've ever said. In everything, actually. And a big part of why those runs were so miserable is 10-2 has the most dynamic class system in Final Fantasy. Because you aren't equipping a class like in 3, even with a secondary ability like in 5. It's even more dynamic than Final Fantasy Tactics with its many ability slots. Because in 10-2, you are equipping a suite of classes that you can, mostly, freely switch between mid-combat. You've stolen with Thief? Good. Stop being one. And Berserker, which I still stand by its identity as basically a monk, really highlights this. Berserkers do one thing well: they hit hard. But they also do it in a variety of ways. 8 different flavors of punch, but with a small little addition. Need some poison? We got you. Enemy has protect? No, they don't. That dragon wants to learn to fly? Hope he figures out landing. So, while Machinist ended up being tedious and Thief sucked, Berserker was breezy, fast, but also had strategy. You have debuffs, you have Dispel Punch, you have counterattack skills that I really should have learned earlier than I did. Heck, you can double your health to comical levels and rely on auto-regen. And honestly, it was pretty fun. Mostly the whole time. And after some truly miserable playthroughs of 10-2, this was a nice, light breeze. Because sometimes girls just want to have fun, and sometimes fun is punching a weapon of mass destruction directly in the face and then striking an incredibly stupid pose, and I support that. And yeah, that brings us to FF12, which gets to slide directly into third. And that is a bit lower than 12 normally ranks, and some of that is my bias. 12 is one of my favorite Final Fantasies, and I will not pretend otherwise. I like the Gambit system, though it could use with a drastic usability overhaul. I like the implementation of the license grid system, except where it does weird things, like lock garbage license behind espers, while better options are easily accessible. It makes me sad that this game didn't get as much recognition as it really deserved on release. But I still can't place this playthrough any higher than third, and as I have said, repeatedly, I love interesting playthroughs. I love strategic considerations. And in these class runs, it can be really interesting to figure out ways to compensate for strengths your party should have, but don't. Which creates a problem when you don't have any weaknesses. Like, the worst it gets is limited status curing, which, yes, monks don't have any real status curing, with no Asuna, no cleanse, no remedy lures, and that does really make a difference in the Elder Worm and Tomato family fight, and nowhere else, because they have more HP than every other class, decently high damage with pulls, and the comboing thereof, and they are even pretty defensive thanks to that weirdly high evasion. And as you near the end of the game, when things should be getting more difficult, oops, we gave all monks Kiraja. It's just baffling. Like, swap the place of White Magic 4 and 9 so everyone can get the weak Kira, but you can only get Kiraja at the end of the game, and that would make way more sense. It just means the end of the game is really anticlimactic. I mean, I recall Black Mages only really struggling because I was relying on X potions and cure spells, and here monks are just chucking out the strongest healing spell in the game? I mean, other than Renew, which monks can actually get after beating an Esper, or Rise, which also, why did they give monks so much white magic? The closest monks get is Revive and Chakra in Final Fantasy Tactics. But regardless, monks are broken in a single class run, and probably pretty good in a casual run. Just add it to Black Mage for all the HP lures and very strong healing magic. So this run falls behind the far more interesting 5 and 10-2 runs, but it's not nearly boring enough to lose out to 1 or 3, though it tried. And that was Final Fantasy, done with monks or monk equivalents in an assortment of games and then compared. And that was surprisingly fun. I don't tend to use monks in most Final Fantasies because they can feel a bit boring to me, but they did not disappoint at all, which was nice. I did want to shout out that I do have a Patreon, linked in the description. I spend a lot of time making these videos, so if you enjoyed the video, want to support the channel, and are financially stable enough to do so, that exists. No pressure though, this channel is free to enjoy for everyone, and will remain that way. For now, if you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. If you'd like to see more of this, feel free to subscribe. Hey, maybe leave a comment if you have something you'd like to say. But whatever you decide to do, have a safe trip home.